Initiating central pawn control, d4 immediately fights for crucial space and opens diagonal pathways for bishops. Developing the knight prepares for central pawn advances and controls key squares, a flexible start towards active piece play. Asserting central space immediately, this move initiates a strategic battle for control of the board's core, setting the stage for dynamic play. A bold gambit opens critical diagonals and challenges central control, promising dynamic play ahead. Seizing the center's open diagonal offers white immediate space and potential attacking lines, forcing black to react. Boldly confronting the pawn, black's knight immediately seeks counterplay, complicating the center's structure and aiming for active squares. Launching a pawn central thrust, white reclaims territory and aims to solidify a commanding presence in the heart of the board. Unbalancing the center, this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's spatial grip and opens vital lines for active piece play. By recapturing, white opens a crucial diagonal for their queen, eyeing black's vulnerable kingside structure. Restoring symmetry and opening the bishop's diagonal offers excellent counterplay. Developing the bishop to its most natural active square, this move reinforces the e4 pawn and prepares for kingside castling, aiming to connect the rooks and activate them on open files, while also asserting influence over the central squares that black will struggle to contest effectively. Unleashing the f-pawn aggressively challenges white's central grip and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Seizing the central pawn creates an immediate tactical imbalance, forcing black to reevaluate their pawn structure and potentially weaken their king's defense by recapturing. Black immediately challenges the central tension, activating the queen aggressively to support the knight and disrupt white's pawn structure, while also preparing to castle. Developing the knight here, white aims to secure the kingside and prepare for castling, simultaneously putting pressure on black's somewhat exposed queen and central pawn structure. This move fosters a more harmonious development for white's pieces, anticipating future pawn breaks and improving the overall control of key squares. It's a subtle yet important step towards solidifying white's position and initiating a more active phase of the game. Suddenly, the bishop finds a delightful outpost, eyes keenly fixed on the vulnerable king's flank after the pawn's untimely retreat. Targeting black's queen with the bishop now opens up possibilities for white to develop aggressively and potentially exploit the slightly uncoordinated black pieces. Unpinning the knight is the primary goal, but it also relinquishes control of the d5 square, potentially allowing white to establish a strong outpost there. Consider if the bishop on g5 is truly a threat that warrants this immediate defensive repositioning, or if developing another piece to support the center would have been more productive. Asserting central influence, the knight rapidly joins the fray, aiming to disrupt black's bishop outpost and prepare for a king's side offensive. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies black's central pawn chain, preparing to contest white's queenside space and potentially reroute the knight towards the kingside if an opportunity arises, while also avoiding immediate tactical weaknesses and creating a more flexible position. Unleashing a knight's influence into the heart of black's position, this maneuver aims to disrupt their development and create immediate tactical threats, potentially isolating pieces and exploiting a weakened kingside. Shifting the queen to f7 creates a subtle but significant threat. It offers a potential escape square should the kingside become too exposed, while simultaneously preparing to reroute it to the kingside if the opportunity arises to join an attack. Securing the monarch is paramount. Castling now swiftly relocates your king to safety behind a fortified pawn chain, simultaneously preparing the rook for active participation on the open files. The castling queenside creates a mirror image of defensive structures, immediately intensifying the pawn storm potential on opposite wings and raising the stakes for king's safety in this sharp gambit. Sharpening the attack, white injects a knight to the central battlefield, creating a crucial outpost and threatening to overwhelm black's slightly disorganized queenside. The knight's new home on d4 pressures key squares, potentially disrupting black's defensive setup and forcing concessions. Dislodging the knight from its defensive post on d4 creates immediate tactical ripples, potentially opening lines for white's pieces while forcing black to reconsider the safety of his queen, which is now exposed to further pressure along the e-file. Activating the queen to contest the central diagonal after the knight exchange initiates a new phase of queenside pressure, seeking to exploit the now exposed black king's shelter. A bold attempt to regain lost tempo by driving the queen, but it overlooks the emerging positional advantage for white along the central files, particularly the d-file, which black's queen now occupies precariously. A bold recapture, aiming to simplify the position and exploit the newly opened lines against black's uncastled king, while simultaneously clearing the way for the rook to join the kingside attack. Opening up the kingside with this pawn advance, black irrevocably exposes their monarch, creating persistent weaknesses that the opponent can exploit for a long time. The queenside expansion is now fully engaged, aiming to disrupt the black king's sanctuary. Black reclaims a pawn, simplifying the position and aiming to neutralize white's knight on d4. This exchange, while seemingly balanced, potentially opens up the g-file for white's rook and creates a slightly awkward structure for black's king on the queenside, a territory that now feels rather exposed. Watch for white's next move, as they might seek to exploit the lack of immediate counterplay for black's minor pieces. Liberating the knight from its d4 entanglement opens up the h-file for the rook, simultaneously pressuring the pawn chain and forcing black to make a defensive concession, as the pawn on f6 is now firmly under scrutiny. Black's bishop, liberated from its pawn chain, now aims to contest the open lines and potentially exploit white's slightly exposed king, a subtle but crucial shift in dynamic as the middle game transitions towards potential complications. Challenging the bishop's control of the long diagonal, white aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially open lines towards the king's shelter. Black recaptures the bishop, simplifying the material and opening the g-file for potential counterplay against white's castled king, albeit with a slightly weakened pawn structure. A decisive blow exploiting the weakened kingside, this capture rips open the diagonal and initiates a forced sequence that will likely strip black's monarch of its crucial defenders. Navigating this complex middle game, black's monarch now seeks a safer haven, aiming to anchor itself on the queen's side and avoid further exposure to the open lines and potential pawn storms. Commanding the open file with the rook immediately enhances white's pressure, forcing black's king into a more exposed position while simultaneously preparing to bring the other rook into the attack. Chasing after that pawn offers a tactical illusion, a tempting distraction that pulls a valuable piece away from the critical central battle, leaving the king's safety compromised and the queenside vulnerable to white's encroaching forces. Clearing the rank now allows your rook to actively contest the crucial open file, potentially creating devastating pressure on black's uncastled king. The rook now anchors itself on the open file, creating immediate pressure and an endgame transition that heavily favors white due to the exposed black king and the structural weaknesses on the queen side. Seizing the bishop with bxh7 opens the h-file for rook infiltration and dramatically exposes the black king's defenses, a crucial tactical geometric advantage. Asserting pressure on the now open c-file, the rook immediately endeavors to disrupt white's coordination, aiming to create a more active endgame by targeting the vulnerable bishop on b2. Fortifying the king's immediate vicinity becomes paramount with this gradual pawn advance, aiming to shield the monarch from potential intrusions down the newly opened g-file and to prepare for a more robust kingside pawn structure. Reclaiming material is a sound instinct, but this particular capture is a tactical misstep that abandons the key central control gained by white's previous rook sacrifice. The pawn on c4 now becomes a static target, offering black absolutely no attacking prospects and merely serving to highlight the structural weakness created. Instead of this pawn grab, a move that aimed to consolidate the bishop's dominance on the dark squares or prepare for a more concerted advance on the kingside would have been far more effective. Solidifying your pawn structure on the kingside aims to prevent any immediate counterplay black might conjure from that direction. while also preparing to potentially advance the h-pawn further and create a passed pawn. Pushing that b-pawn creates significant queenside space, threatening to expand further and potentially trap white's bishop if it ventures too far down that flank, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn breakthroughs, or simply solidifying black's territorial gains after white's recent sacrifices. Securing the king with a purposeful step backward, King 2 now charts a course to safety, recognizing the ever-present danger lurking on the open files and the potential for black's bishops to coordinate their attack. Unlocking queenside expansion, this maneuver seeks to exploit the open file and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and establish long-term territorial advantage. Asserting a commanding presence on the queenside, the pawn now advances, aiming to disrupt black's newly established pawn structure and potentially open a path for future queenside expansion. Relocating the bishop to g7 offers a more active defense, untangling it from the pawn chain and preparing to support a potential advance of the pawn, while also keeping an eye on the now weakened dark squares around white's king. Unlocking the kingside presence, this pawn advances, aiming to restrict black's bishop and potentially spearhead an assault. Reasserting some outpost on the kingside, the bishop seeks a more active diagonal, preparing to support an eventual advance of the g-pawn and create counterplay along the h-file, even as it abandons the defense of the crucial 7th rank. Re-establishing control over the open file offers white a chance to consolidate and potentially initiate a centralized advance, though the pawn structure remains somewhat compromised. The rook sidles into a more aggressive position, threatening to infiltrate the queenside and potentially create a dangerous passed pawn down the file, forcing white to carefully consider its defensive structure. Unveiling a hidden threat, the bishop tucks away, preparing to rejoin the fray on the kingside should circumstances permit, while simultaneously securing the precious pawn on h5. Reasserting control over the now open d-file is crucial for black to neutralize white's initiative and prevent further infiltration towards the weakened kingside. Unleashing a decisive check, the rook aggressively invades the 7th rank, forcing black's king into an exposed position and initiating a swift endgame advantage for white. Retrieving the rook to the 7th rank forces a crucial decision: defend the king or contest the open file. The decisive check forces the exchange of rooks, simplifying into a pawn race where white holds a slight advantage due to better pawn structure on the kingside and black's doubled pawns on the queenside. Exchanging the rooks initiates an endgame where black's king suddenly finds itself exposed on the d7 square, no longer shielded by its defending pieces, presenting a significant positional vulnerability for the remainder of the game. The monarch steps out from behind the pawn shield, aiming to finally activate its dormant power and become a more active participant in the endgame, seeking safer squares as the opponent's rook continues its menacing patrol. Establishing a solid pawn wall on the queenside, c5 aims to impede white's knight from re-entering play via b6, and also serves to create a more defensible structure for black's king, preventing any premature incursions. Carving out space for the king with g4 immediately addresses the encroaching black pieces, creating a vital breathing room and a defensive shield for the monarch. Asserting control over the central files and preventing white's pawn from advancing further is the primary objective here. This pawn push seeks to dislodge white's knight and potentially open lines for its own pieces. Pushing the pawn forward here aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the g-file, while also limiting the mobility of black's bishop on h6. The bishop retreats to a passive square, allowing white's pawns to advance aggressively on the kingside and create a passed pawn. Unleashing the pawn on the h-file now exerts significant pressure, threatening to become a dangerous passed pawn and forcing black to constantly consider its advance and the potential weaknesses it creates on the dark squares around the king. The pawn push on the queenside aims to carve out space and create a passed pawn, a crucial endgame objective. Pushing the f-pawn here aims to create further space for the white pieces and potentially open lines for attack, but it also weakens the kingside's pawn structure considerably, making it a double-edged decision. The king ventures out, seeking active participation in the pawn race, but exposes itself to potential harassment along the open diagonals and files. Elevating the pawn to the 7th rank, h7, exerts immense pressure, threatening to advance further and transform into a queen, a decisive advantage in this endgame. The bishop's retreat to g7 signals a shift toward defensive consolidation, aiming to secure the newly created outpost for the king. Unleashing the pawn's potential on the queen side suddenly shifts the dynamic, creating a dynamic pawn structure that demands immediate attention and careful maneuvering. The pawn's determined crawl to the 3rd rank finally arrests the rook's potential infiltration down the open file, a crucial defensive maneuver to preserve the remaining queenside structure. Pushing the king further into the pawn storm's path, a bold gamble to activate its defensive capabilities against black's advanced queenside majority. Securing the bishop's escape route seems paramount now, as it's the last piece capable of challenging white's advancing pawn on the kingside. Pawns now march, a promising advance to create a passed threat, forcing a positional concession from black.